Hello, dear chess friends. I'm International Master Andrey Ostrovskiy, and you're welcome to the series of lessons dedicated to essentials of bishop endgames. In this lesson, we're going to discuss the basic theory of opposite-colored bishop endgames. We have to understand that opposite-colored bishop endgames tend to be drawish in many cases. The main reason is that bishops simply can't get in contact, and this seriously reduces the chances of the strongest side. For instance, positions with only one extra pawn, like the one you see on the board now, are simply deadly drawish. For the strongest sides, there is no way to make progress, because actually the only possible activity is to promote the pawn, but in that case, bishop simply sacrifices itself for this pawn, and it's a draw because it's not possible to win the game with only the bishop on the board. So for the side which defends himself, it's important just to control one of the squares of opponent's pawn on its way to this promotion square. In this concrete example, black controls the promotion square. Why not, if it is possible? So to make a draw, black has to keep the bishop on this diagonal h3, c8. So bishop goes to h3. It doesn't really matter where the bishop goes. So it's just important to be on this diagonal. Bishop to h3, and once the pawn goes to c8, bishop takes it, king takes it, and it's a dead draw. So let's get to trickier examples, and the next one will be with two extra pawns for the strongest side. We have almost the same position, the difference is that white has one additional pawn on c5. So this position is still drawish, since pawns are not that efficient, right? Pawns are doubled, so they're not that strong, but black has to play accurately here. So let's have a look what white can do. For instance, bishop goes to g5, just to control d8 square, so that's to prevent black's king d8 and king c8 maneuver. So, by the way, you have to know that it is one of the possible methods of making a draw, just to blockade opponent's pawn. And since here we deal with doubled pawns, well, it will be just enough to blockade both, right? And if king occupies c8 square, it is a light square. It won't be possible for white to deal with such a blockading piece, since white's bishop is a dark squared one, so it will be also a dead draw. So bishop g5 looks like a natural idea. Black plays bishop to f5, keeping the bishop on this diagonal, and after c7 keeps doing the same. So at the moment we can't see a difference compared to the previous example. The difference is actually seen after c6. So here we can see that white has actually a winning plan, and it is quite simple, quite natural. So the king simply goes to b7, controls the square of promotion, and white plays c8. And now the basic idea for black to sacrifice the bishop makes no sense, because white will still have the pawn after this sacrifice, so that will be an easily winning position. So for black, it is important to come up with the smart defense. So first of all, bishop goes to c8, blockading the pawn, at the same time controlling square b7. So now for white, it is not that simple to control c8 square. Well, to do that, the king has to go to b8 square now. So the only way for white to make progress. King goes to c5. And now it's important to use the king, because if black remains passive, let's say plays bishop h3, then the king simply gets closer and it's a winning position for white. So c8, winning the bishop first, and then c6 is being promoted. So now after king c5, black comes up with a great maneuver. King goes to f7. King becomes active. And now we will see why it is so important. King goes to b6. King goes to e6, king goes to a7, king goes to d5. And now we can see what happened. So after king goes to b8, attacking the bishop, bishop goes away. And after c8 queen, it is anyway the only possibility for white to make progress. Bishop takes c8, king takes c8, And now the role of the king becomes decisive because king simply takes c6, eliminating the last pawn, and now it's a dead draw. So passive defense doesn't help in this situation, and only active defense, attacking another pawn, helps black to make a draw. Very important position to remember. Other ways of trying to win the game also don't help. Let's say if instead of bishop g5, white plays king to c7, also sensible move, just get into b8 quickly. So in this case, it is very important to prevent it. And the way to do this is bishop to f3, just pinning the king to c6 pawn, right? So white can't afford losing one of his pawns. After that, we already discussed it will be a dead draw. So bishop f3, just attacking c6, so that preventing king to b8. White has, of course, king b7 move, but this makes no difference because pawn c6 is simply pinned. So black keeps the bishop on this diagonal, and white can't make a progress. So the king can't be activated, c7 can't be played, so everything that white has is just to go back to c7, maybe to go back to d6, after which it's possible to repeat the position with the help of bishop g4, and we can see that white made no progress, or just make king d8 move, which will be probably the best one in this situation. And as we discussed before, once the king occupies c8 square, it is a dead draw because it is not possible to kick this king away from this great blockading position. Another way for white to try to win is after bishop a3 to try king to c6, just preparing king to b7. In this case, again, the best move for black is bishop g2 check. So if king goes back, then bishop also goes back. If king goes to b6, this gives up a control over d7 square. So king goes to d7, aiming to occupy c8 square. So as we can see, every time we have to understand what the strongest side wants to do, and to prevent that with the help of different methods. So in this example, we saw two very important methods. So the one method was to activate the king. So active king usually helps to attack opponent's pawns, so that in this particular case, it helped black to eliminate the last pawn. And another very important method, it's just to pin opponent's king to protecting own pawn. Like here, after king c7, bishop f3, pinning the king to c6 pawn, so that preventing king to b8. So let's get to more complicated examples. In this position, white also has two extra pawns, and they are much better than in the previous example. So they are not doubled, they are both passed pawns, and quite dangerous ones, and they are far from each other. So this type of positions, it's very, very good for the strongest side, because for the side which tries to make a draw, it is quite hard to coordinate the work of the king and the bishop to stop both pawns. So the plan for the strongest side is usually to get to the pawn which is stopped by the bishop with the king, and just to ensure its promotion. So as a rule, the further pawns are placed from each other, the easier it is to win, because it is harder for the side which wants to make a draw to coordinate the work of the king and the bishop. So the squares that should be controlled are far from each other, so the defense is simply being torn apart. So in this position, to accomplish the plan, white plays bishop to f3, protecting c6 pawn, prior to moving the king to the king side. A smart move, just protecting the pawn and preventing black's king taking c6. Bishop goes to h4, so black has nothing better than just waiting. King goes to e6, already controlling f6 square. It's no longer possible for black just to stay and wait, because white's plan is pretty much straightforward. So the pawn goes to f7, and then simply to the promotion square. And if bishop stops it from diagonal, let's say h6, f8, then king goes to e7 and ensures the promotion of the pawn. After which, well, white will have extra bishop and pawn, which is more than enough to win a game. So king d8, black tries to control some squares with the king. So king from d8 at the same time with stopping white's pawn c6 controls square e7, so that's limiting the activity of white's king, more or less. f6, bishop g5, f7. So white improves his position move by move. Now black has a choice between playing bishop h6 and bishop e7. Bishop e7 loses on the spot because of c7 move. So this deflects the king from the bishop, after which white easily wins, promoting the pawn to a queen. So after f7, the only way for black to stop the pawn is bishop to h6. And now, since e7 is controlled by opponent's king, white's king tries to find another place, another possibility to support the pawn f7. And it's easy to understand that such a square might be g8. So king goes to f6, bishop f8, king goes to g6, king goes to e7. At first glance, stopping the way of the king to g8 square. In fact, it is not true, because after king h7, pawn f7 is invulnerable. Why? Because, well, after king takes f7, white plays c7, and black can't stop this pawn since the bishop is a dark squared one, and c8 square is the square of the light color, so the king is far away, and white wins. So king h7, just straightforwardly going to g8 square, and black has nothing better than just to wait a bit. King goes to d8, king goes to g8. The rest is simple. If the bishop goes away, white simply promotes the pawn. If king goes to e7, again c7, deflecting the king, taking the bishop, and winning the game. Sometimes, however, this pattern might be not that easy, and the next example shows the complications that might arise. In this position, we can see the same distance between the pawns, right? So only 2 files. And the problem is that the pawns are very close to the edge of the board, and one of the pawn is on the A file. By the way, it is very important that white's bishop is light squared, because in case black sacrifices the bishop for the D file, the last pawn can be promoted, which we will see later in this example. So white still has a winning plan, since white has 2 extra pawns, and performing one interesting tactical trick, white can improve the position and to come up with the same plan like in the previous example. But at first glance, it looks like it is not that simple to make a progress, because, well, if bishop gets to d6 blockading the pawn, it's not that clear how to improve the position. So white has bishop f3 move, setting up the bishop on this long diagonal, so that's supporting a6 pawn in a promotion to a queen. And at some point, it will be possible even to sacrifice the d file, ensuring the promotion of the pawn. For example, this happens after bishop f8 move or anything else on this diagonal without blockading d5 pawn, so pawn goes to d6, and after capturing a7, and it's not possible to stop the pawn anymore. So bishop goes to d6, and here white has a way to move, which is the best way to make a progress in this position, because king can't go away from c6 square. In this case, white easily wins, breaking through with the king. The king can't go far from a6 pawn. In this case, pawn goes to a7 and simply promotes. So black is more or less forced to make a move with the bishop, after which it's possible to play d6. So now a7 is a great threat. Black simply can't take the pawn d6, so king goes to b8, the only way to stop the pawn in this case. And now d7. So white made a great progress here already. If bishop goes to c7, then after king c6, it is a very easy position for white to win. After bishop a5, the king simply goes there to e8, and since a7 is a great threat, it's not possible to help the bishop with the king, so white wins easily here. If king goes to c7 in this position, that white wins on the spot after a7. So after d7, bishop h4 is the only move. King goes to c6, king goes to a7, bishop goes to d3. Of course, it is important to save pawn a6. Bishop goes to d8, and after king d6, king b8, king e6, bishop h4, king f7. So this maneuver we already saw in the previous example. And king goes to c7. We can see that, well, white has some problems at first glance. So after king e8, bishop goes to g5. And the move, which could be winning in vast majority of cases, a7, just deflecting the king here, doesn't help because after king b7, king simply attacks the pawn. It's not possible to save this pawn, which means that it is a draw already. King takes pawn a7, bishop sacrifices itself for d7 pawn. But bishop goes to e4 here, just waiting a bit and creating a threat of a7 and promoting the pawn, which deflects the king for a while. King goes to b6. But still, it might be not that clear how to make a progress, because true, if bishop goes back to d3 protecting the pawn, king also goes back to c7, covering d8 square. But there is a winning maneuver. So bishop goes to b7 first, protecting the pawn a6 and regaining the threat of d8 with the promotion. This forces the king to c8, and bishop goes to c8. Decisive waiting move, controlling b7 square, so that creating the threat of a7 with the promotion, and at the same time protecting a6 pawn. So black's king b6 move no longer efficient because it is not the attack against a6. So white simply has the chance to promote the pawn, after which this position is easily winning because white has a bishop of a correct color. So this bishop controls light squares. This bishop controls the square of the promotion of a pawn, and it is a theoretically winning position. It's not a big deal to win it. So king c7, king b6, king b8, then a7, for example. And if king goes to the corner, then bishop b7, and it is already a checkmate. Thanks a lot for your attention. See you next lessons.